The desert night carried sound farther than it should have. In a wooden barracks at Papago Park, Karl Friedrich lay on his bunk with his boots still laced, listening to the camp settle into its official silence. The last call from a guard post, the latch at the door, the measured steps on a watchtower platform, and the sweep of a searchlight across gravel until it stopped at the fence line. Under that layer came quieter movements that did not belong to the Americans at all, soft footfalls kept close to the floor, a cough suppressed halfway, and the drawn-out sound of a man breathing too fast for sleep. Papago Park sat near Phoenix, where desert scrub met canals and straight roads. The camp ran on repetition and paperwork. Roll calls counted bodies by face. Work details marched out and back on fixed routes. Meals arrived in rationed portions that required signatures and tallies. The military police kept order with keys, flashlights, and routines that discouraged improvisation. Patrol the lanes, check the doors, make the rounds at set intervals, record what mattered, ignore what did not. The system did not ask the guards to understand the prisoners, only to keep a ledger that held. The rhythm changed after a death inside the camp. An accused collaborator had been killed, and the news moved without an announcement, carried by posture and glances, by men choosing different seats at mess and falling silent when a name approached. The Americans responded in the way their system demanded. Patrols came more often at night. Doors were checked twice. The infirmary stayed lit later. A translator appeared at odd hours and moved with calm purpose, following established procedure. The Germans responded faster, and they did it in daylight because daylight made coercion look like administration. After morning count, while bodies loosened into motion toward work details, a German corporal drifted along the ranks, keeping men aligned. His hair was clipped close, his hands empty, his voice low enough to blend into the scrape of boots. He did not threaten. He offered paper. It was torn from a notebook, lines drawn with pencil, names written in block letters. At the top was a pledge of loyalty and a denunciation of cooperation with the enemy. It carried no stamp and no seal. Inside the barracks it carried the weight of a sentence. The paper moved through hands with deliberate slowness. Men signed with the same care they used on ration tallies because everyone understood that the signature itself was less important than the moment of signing. Those who stepped forward quickly were treated as reliable. Those who hesitated were treated as a problem that required attention. The corporal watched, then nodded to a second man who watched the watchers. The Americans had their roll call list. The hard men created a list that was never posted on a wall, and it was enforced anyway. Karl signed early. He did not believe in the pledge as honor. He believed in it as payment. Delay registered as dissent, and dissent had become a currency that other men used to buy influence over his life. He wrote his name carefully, returned the pencil, and kept his face blank, showing no cost. He expected the transaction to close. Instead, it opened a ledger. Within hours, the signature had been declared insufficient. A pledge on paper was easy to deny later. A pledge needed to be reinforced with behavior, and behavior needed witnesses. That afternoon, the corporal pulled Karl toward the edge of a work column where a guard line of sight broke for a few steps behind the mess hall. The instruction came like a task assignment. When an American gave an order, Karl would comply, but not too cleanly. He would pause half a breath. He would move last. At evening count, he would delay the turn of his head when his name was called. In the mess line, he would scrape his tin plate against the counter, louder than necessary. On a work detail, he would keep his eyes down when a guard spoke, letting the silence hang for a single beat. Once, when the column turned a corner and the guard ahead faced away, Karl was told to spit into the dust and then grind it flat with his boot. The tests ran in parallel with the camp machinery. The Americans relied on predictability. fixed times for counts, fixed rosters for labor, fixed patrol lanes. The hard men relied on the same predictability to schedule demands in the gaps. They used the minute after roll call when bodies loosened into motion, the short walk from latrine to barracks when eyes turned away, the jostle at meal issue when a guard focused on order instead of intent. They placed watchers where a guard did not look, and they made the watchers easy to notice. A man did not need to be struck to understand he had been seen. The example they needed appeared on its own. A thin soldier who shook in the cold mornings and spoke too often about home drew attention because fear showed on him. He signed the pledge late, his letters uneven. He asked the translator too many questions at work detail, not because he was plotting, but because he wanted certainty in a place built to deny it. The hard men began to stand close to him during counts and meals, not touching, only narrowing the space around him. A portion of bread went missing from his tray. A blanket was moved from his bunk. Nothing that a guard would record, nothing that qualified as violence, and nothing the thin soldier stopped. Karl watched the thin soldier and felt a weight settle behind his ribs. He did not like the man, and the dislike made the fear sharper because it removed any comforting fantasy of heroism. The thin soldier was simply vulnerable, and vulnerability was enough. Karl tried to bargain with reality by lowering his profile and doing what was asked with minimal damage. He completed the gestures. He avoided the guard who looked too closely. He kept his face neutral when the corporal watched him, and he kept his eyes on the gravel when the thin soldier glanced toward him for help. Each choice bought him another day. Each choice also tightened the proof that others used him. On the third night after the pledge, the demands moved from gestures to roles. The corporal did not ask Karl to sign again. He assigned him to stand near the barracks door after lights out and watch the walkway. He was not to challenge anyone, not to signal, not to interfere. He was to be present and to remember. Presence made him a witness, and a witness became an accomplice through silence. Karl positioned himself where the tower light painted the gravel pale and where movement would be visible from a guard platform. The hard men waited until the tower guard reached the far end of his pacing, then moved with the confidence of men who had rehearsed in the same narrow corridor of time night after night. Two figures slid along the wall between patches of light. A third paused close to Karl and touched his sleeve, not a grip, a reminder that his role existed. Inside the barracks, bodies shifted into a line that blocked the aisle. A blanket lifted and fell. A mattress creaked under redistributed weight. The thin soldier began to breathe faster, a tight stutter that carried in the quiet. He tried to control it and failed. Karl stood rigid, watching the searchlight sweep and stop, and realizing that the Americans policed the fence and still did not own the night inside the barracks. Two actions lay in front of him: step forward and break the line, or call out and force a patrol to act. Either choice would write his name into the hard men record in a different ink. The earlier pledge had bought him nothing except the privilege of being used. The earlier gestures had already been witnessed and stored. If he acted now, the hard men would claim he had recruited American attention as revenge for German discipline. If he stayed still, the hard men would own him through the role they had assigned and the silence they demanded. Karl understood then that the first signature had not been a shield, it had been a handle. After that night, the barracks performed innocence with the precision of men who had learned how to hide a crime from themselves. Bodies lay flat when the tower light swept the window slats. Coughs were swallowed. The Americans completed their patrol on schedule, checked the latch, and moved on, leaving behind a silence that belonged to the prisoners again. Morning count ran like machinery. Names were read from a list. Answers came in the cadence expected. A guard marked totals in a notebook and closed it with a practice slap. The camp advanced on repetition, and repetition produced gaps. The hard men filled those gaps with their own accounting. The pledge paper returned, not as a test, but as a record. The corporal kept it folded in his palm and revealed it only to the men who needed to understand that signatures had been noted and remembered. Karl had signed early, expecting the transaction to end. It had only registered his willingness to be managed. By noon, the corporal informed him that paper loyalty did not hold without action loyalty. The new proof would be behavior, and behavior required witnesses. The first tasks were engineered to be deniable and to be seen. Karl was told to delay his step when a guard ordered the column to move, then correct himself without apology. He was told to drag a shovel once so it rang on stone and drew a guard's attention, then look away. He was told to let a spit fall into the dust when a guard's back turned, then grind it flat with his boot. Each action lasted a second. Each action created a fact that the hard men could later confirm. They worked inside the camp schedule. They used the minute after roll call when bodies loosened into motion, the press of the mess line when the server focused on portions, the walk back from the latrine when a man could be pinned between bunks with no sound beyond breathing. The Americans controlled the fence. The hard men controlled the interstices. The thin soldier became the template. His hands shook in the cold mornings. He asked the translator questions at work detail, not as a plot, but as a plea for certainty. He signed the pledge late, his letters unsteady. The hard men narrowed space around him in small, reversible ways. His blanket slid from his bunk to the floor. His bread portion shrank. A tool issued to him vanished and reappeared in another man's hands. Nothing rose to the level of a report. Everything carried a message. Karl complied with the first tasks in their mildest form, trying to buy safety at the lowest price. On the second day, the price rose. At morning count, several men answered half a beat off, late and early in a pattern that ruined the line's rhythm and then corrected itself. The guard with the notebook frowned, ran his finger down the page again, and made a second mark beside a name. Work detail provided the next stage. The prisoners hauled scrap and moved dirt under a sun that made the air shimmer above the canal. Dust clung to sweat and turned skin into grit. Water breaks arrived in measured intervals under supervision. The hard men used those intervals to distribute assignments. Karl was told to misplace a tool and then insist he had never received it. Another prisoner was told to drag his feet so the column stretched and a guard had to shout. The thin soldier was ordered to drop his shovel once when the guard walked by and then pick it up without apology. The shovel hit hard ground with a sharp crack. The guard strode over and seized the thin soldier by the sleeve, forcing him upright and back into place. The guard did not strike him. He withheld the thin soldier's water break and wrote a note. The translator watched, expressionless, ready to interpret but not to intervene. Karl saw the thin soldier swallow dry air and understood how fast official discipline could be turned into private leverage. That evening, the thin soldier's bread disappeared entirely. The empty space on his plate became a signal. Later, after lights out, the aisle filled with men who did not sleep. The hard men rehearsed technique in whispers, timed to the intervals between patrol steps, how to jam a latch so a door did not close cleanly, how to nudge a man awake without leaving marks, how to make a small act look like a big insult when it reached a guard's ear. Karl was required to carry instructions and to prevent refusal from becoming visible. The thin soldier had to remain functional. A collapse in the wrong place would draw scrutiny before the hard men had shaped the narrative. Karl saw the trap. If he pushed too hard, he would cause the collapse. If he eased off, he would be accused of shielding disloyalty. He attempted resistance in the smallest way he could sustain. He altered timing. He let one instruction die, never reaching the thin soldier. He delayed the thin soldier's assigned action to a moment when the guard would be farther away. It was mercy, and it was self-defense, because an incident in a guard's direct view would turn marks into measures. The watchers corrected him. On the work line, when the thin soldier hesitated at the wrong second, the corporal stepped in and guided him forward with a hand on the shoulder, a quiet claim of ownership. The thin soldier completed the gesture in clumsy panic, and the guard noticed. The guard shouted, halted the column, and extended the detail's work period. Sun and thirst became collective punishment. The hard men let resentment spread through the line, then aimed it at the thin soldier and at Karl. That night Karl was summoned after lights out. 2 men blocked the aisle. The corporal stood where the tower light fell weakest. No one struck Karl. The hard men preferred punishments that left no bruise to explain. They kept him standing at the end wall, facing wood for hours. Every time his knees bent, a hand slapped the plank beside his head, a warning calibrated to wake him without blood. Sleep deprivation arrived as a system. The next morning, Karl's name was on a different roster. He was sent to the latrine detail, hauling slop buckets and scrubbing boards in a stench that clung to skin after rinsing. The American corporal supervising the job watched Karl's pace and wrote another note when he paused. The camp's official discipline and the hard men's private discipline ran in parallel and fed each other. The hard men forced friction that produced notes. The notes justified harder assignments that exhausted men and made resistance slow. By the 4th day, the pledge paper returned in a new form. Lines were added beside names, not for signatures, but for confirmations of acts completed. The hard men turned deniable defiance into a ledger, each entry bound to a witness and a time window. Karl saw that the ledger was designed to make withdrawal impossible. A man could not protest to the Americans without confessing participation. A man could not refuse the hard men without inviting punishment from within. The thin soldier deteriorated in visible increments. He woke before the tower light reached the barracks and sat upright, breathing too fast, listening for feet in the aisle. He ate slower, then not at all. Noise startled him, the slam of a door, the rattle of a mess tin. The hard men treated each symptom as proof. They began to speak of him in front of others with careful contempt, framing him as the reason the guards watched more closely and the reason rations felt tighter. Karl understood the narrative being built around him as well. When a guard marked a name, the hard men implied Karl had attracted attention by failing to enforce discipline. When a work period stretched, they implied Karl had bungled timing. When a man lost bread, they implied Karl had permitted softness. The story made Karl responsible for every friction with the Americans and every weakness among Germans. It gave the hard men justification for retaliation and gave bystanders a reason to accept it. On the 5th night, the task stopped pretending to be gestures. The corporal assigned Karl the doorway again. He was to watch the walkway and keep the tower light in his peripheral vision. He was to signal if it lingered too long. Inside, other men would block the aisle. The thin soldier would be brought to the center of the barracks under the pretense of instruction. Karl understood the next step would no longer be deniable, and he understood why the hard men wanted him at the door. His presence would bind him to whatever happened inside. The 6th night began with the same official signals of control and the same private signals of takeover. The tower light swept the gravel, paused at the fence, and returned. The patrol lane outside carried the scrape of boots at fixed intervals, a schedule the camp relied on to keep order without constant force. Inside Barracks 4, men stayed flat until the steps passed. Then the aisle filled again with bodies that moved without speaking. Karl stood at the doorway where the corridor draft slipped under the frame. The latch plate was worn bright from hands. His assignment looked harmless on paper: watch the walkway, track the tower light, signal if the beam lingered. The hard men had given him the job for a different reason. They wanted his presence to certify that the door and the time window belonged to them, and they wanted him close enough to be bound to whatever happened next. The thin soldier sat upright on his bunk, eyes open, breath shallow. Two men positioned themselves at the aisle's midpoint, not gripping him, only denying him the route to the latrine and the door. Others spread along the bunks as spectators, a ring designed to pass for rest if an American stepped in. Since the earlier death in the camp, the Americans had increased patrols and kept the infirmary lit later, but the hard men still worked in the seams between rounds. Their method was consistent. They engineered humiliations that looked like indiscipline to the guards, then used the guard response as a justification for harsher internal control. The corporal entered the aisle and leaned close to the thin soldier. A blanket lifted and fell. A hand tapped the bunk frame once, a signal. The thin soldier's breathing accelerated, then stuttered. Karl felt his options compress. If he rushed the aisle, the hard men would swarm him before any American was compelled to act. If he stayed still, the night would end with a new fact that daylight rules could not undo. The hard men had already built a ledger around him with signatures and witnesses, and the ledger did not allow refunds. He used the camp's procedures against the hard men's control. He shifted his weight and pushed the door outward a fraction. The hinge complained in the stillness. He let it complain again and allowed the latch to settle wrong, so it clicked against the strike plate. The sound did not resemble a fight. It resembled a door that did not secure, a detail that fit an MP's checklist and demanded a second look. The corporal's head turned toward him. The watchers stiffened. Karl kept his hands visible on the wood and corrected the door with deliberate slowness, letting the latch click once more. The patrol lane answered. A flashlight beam flashed through the window slits, then held. Footsteps stopped at the threshold. The door opened. Corridor light cut a hard rectangle across the aisle and revealed men who had not been sleeping. A guard stood at the threshold, with his light steady, reading posture without needing explanation. Behind him came the heavier stride of an MP on night duty, then a second MP who stayed in the corridor to keep the doorway clear. The hard men shifted instantly into stillness, bodies dropping to bunks too late to look natural. The thin soldier rose as if the light pulled him up. His knees shook. His hands fluttered at his sides, then clenched. The MP's flashlight swept his face and held there long enough to register distress as a condition, not a claim. The camp's authority required observable grounds, and the thin soldier's body supplied them. The MP stepped into the barracks and moved between the thin soldier and the aisle blockage, breaking the pattern with position rather than violence. The second MP remained at the door and looked down the corridor toward the next patrol point, maintaining a channel for reinforcements. Within minutes, a translator arrived, carrying a notebook and pencil, summoned by routine. An infirmary orderly followed with a blanket and a metal cup, his movements efficient, practiced, and unhurried. The thin soldier sagged as soon as the MPs held the room. His breath broke into short pulls. The orderly draped the blanket around his shoulders and guided the cup to his hands. The translator spoke softly, and the thin soldier's gaze steadied enough for the MPs to move him out without a struggle. The corporal took a step forward, then stopped when the MP at the door shifted his stance and made the line of authority visible. The hard men ruled by making others hesitate. The MPs ruled by making hesitation useless. The Americans did not drag the rest of the barracks into the corridor. They did not punish everyone to intimidate a few. They left most men on their bunks and kept their attention narrow. The prisoner in distress, the immediate space, the names and positions that belonged in a log. The guard at the threshold noted the time and the reason for entry, a door that did not secure properly, and a prisoner in visible medical trouble. The translator wrote the same time, the same observation, and the routine for medical response and custody. In a POW camp, staged loyalty tests can turn deniable defiance into a coercive machine until disciplined procedure breaks its monopoly on fear. Karl remained by the doorway, his assigned role exposed and his value shifting. The MPs returned after the thin soldier was secured in an infirmary side room where staff could watch him and where the hard men could not control access. The camp had limited beds and limited staff, and the arrangement was not comfort. It was protection implemented within capacity and backed by patrol frequency and locked doors. The MPs did not demand speeches. They asked for facts that were verifiable. Who had been assigned to the door, who had blocked the aisle, who had orchestrated the previous nights. The translator turned questions into German and wrote down answers in a column that matched rosters. Karl felt a tightening behind his ribs, not from fear of Americans, but from the recognition that his silence no longer functioned as shelter. Silence had become a tool the hard men used to keep him bound. He gave facts with the precision he had learned in uniform. He described the pledge paper and the signatures. He described how the paper returned with added lines to confirm acts completed. He placed the first behavior tests into time windows defined by the camp's routine, after morning count, during mess issue, between patrol rounds. He identified the corporal by bunk location and work assignment, and he identified the watchers by where they stood and who carried instructions. He described the doorway assignment as an imposed role and the aisle blockage as a repeated pattern intended to isolate the thin soldier. The MP wrote in his own notebook, then compared his notes with the translator's page. Two sets of handwriting formed a record that did not belong to German factions. It belonged to the camp, and that distinction mattered. The hard men's ledger relied on fear and private memory. The camp record relied on dates, positions, and routine, and it traveled upward through the chain that governed the camp. By dawn, the thin soldier still had not returned to Barracks 4. His bedding was moved to the infirmary area and replaced with a bare mattress kept in a room that patrols checked. The MPs conducted a second count in the barracks, then closed the door and moved on. The camp system did what it always did after an incident. It narrowed risk by moving people and increasing scrutiny, not by dramatizing punishment. Karl's consequence arrived before noon. A new roster was posted, and his name appeared under a different barracks number near the administrative fence where patrols passed more often and where fewer Germans held influence. He carried his blanket roll across the lane under a pale sun and felt eyes through the slats track him without sound. No one shouted. No one needed to. The hard men marked him by letting everyone see that he was being moved. In the new barracks, the air smelled of dust and disinfectant. The bunks were occupied by men who kept to themselves, men who had been relocated for reasons that did not need to be spoken aloud. Karl sat on a mattress that held no heat and listened to the camp settle into its daytime rhythm. The next roll call forming, work details assembling, the infirmary door opening and closing under supervision. Fear remained, but it no longer belonged entirely to the hard men's timing. The night inside the camp now followed a timetable the hard men could not fully control. Morning count in the new barracks sounded the same as in the old one, but it carried a different weight. The guard read names from a roster held close to his chest. Answers came back in German accents and clipped tones. The MP at his side watched the line more than the ledger. scanning faces and stances in a way that made clear the camp had decided to measure more than numbers. Karl's relocation did not come with an explanation. It came with a directive stamped in routine. New barracks assignment, new work detail, new position in the roll call line. His blanket and spare clothing fit into a role that he carried himself. No escort marched him as a spectacle. No one needed to advertise a decision that everyone would interpret anyway. The hard men had used lists and witnesses to bind him. The camp used lists and patrol routes to separate him. The shift had material consequences. The new barracks sat closer to administrative buildings and the medical area where the infirmary stayed lit later. Patrol passes came more often, and the corridor outside held sound differently, less muffled, more open. Space alone reduced the hard men's ability to assemble a ring in the aisle without being seen. The camp had not eliminated violence, it had narrowed opportunity. Karl's work assignment changed as well. Instead of latrine detail, he was placed on a general maintenance crew that moved supplies between buildings under direct MP supervision. The tasks were ordinary: carry crates, stack boards, sweep gravel from walkways after windstorms pushed it back. Ordinary tasks mattered because they defined where a man could be, who could speak to him, and what small items could be exchanged without notice. Under increased supervision, the informal economy of threats and favors became harder to operate. The thin soldier remained in a side room near the infirmary, not in comfort, but within a perimeter the hard men could not penetrate. He was checked by staff and watched by MPs who logged each entry and exit. When he walked, it was with an orderly at his side. When he ate, it was at a table where the door stayed in view. The camp had limited beds and limited staff. Protection took the form of controlled access and recorded movement. A translator visited him and wrote down statements in the same restrained format used for supply counts and incident logs. The questions stayed factual: times, locations, assignments, names connected to bunks and work rosters. The answers were not treated as confessions that required submission. They were treated as input into a system that could act only on what it could document. The hard men adjusted to the new constraints the way they always had, by searching for the seams. They shifted their pressure into daytime, where patrols were less intrusive and where retaliation could be disguised as ordinary friction. At mess, a man bumped Karl's shoulder hard enough to slosh thin soup across his tin. On the work line, a crate was shoved into his hands without warning, forcing him to absorb the weight and stumble. In the latrine corridor, a boot scraped his heel as men filed past. Small injuries did not require explanation, and small injuries kept the message alive. Rumor did not need a voice. It moved through absence. Karl's former barracks did not call to him in the yard. Men who had once exchanged cigarettes avoided his gaze. The hard men did not have to announce that he had spoken. His relocation and the increased patrol presence around the infirmary announced it for them. Their power relied on defining who belonged and who did not. The camp's protective separation delivered the same social verdict. The camp responded with procedures that looked dull from a distance and decisive up close. Barracks were reassigned by clusters that broke up the men most likely to organize others. Work details were reshuffled so the same group did not control a corridor day after day. Patrol patterns changed, not randomly, but enough to make timing uncertain. A guard checked a door twice, then wrote it down. An MP paused at the barracks end, listened, and moved on without drama. Each action denied the hard men a reliable schedule. Karl came to understand the difference between punishment and governance. The camp did not perform its authority with cruelty. It used administrative friction. It used movement orders. It used the dull insistence of logs. This did not make Karl safe in the way he had once imagined safety, as belonging within a group that could shelter him. It made him safe in a narrower way, as a body less available to those who treated bodies as tools. At night the new barracks settled into silence under the same tower light and the same desert wind, but the aisle remained emptier. Men still rose to use the latrine. Men still whispered. The difference lay in the limits of assembly. When two figures stood too long near another bunk, a guard pass occurred sooner than expected. When a door latch clicked twice, a flashlight beam returned and lingered. The hard men could still threaten, but they could not as easily stage a tribunal with a stable perimeter. Karl's own routines changed. He stopped watching for the corporal's signal and began watching for institutional rhythm. He tracked patrol intervals, not to hide an insult, but to predict when a corridor would be safe for movement. He learned which doors stayed locked and which were checked. He learned which staff members carried notebooks and which carried keys. These details formed a new kind of shelter, not based on loyalty, but on predictability. The camp's larger machinery moved beyond Karl's sight. Reports traveled through the administrative chain, statements were compared, names were matched against rosters. The institution that held the camp could not ignore a killing inside its wire, and it could not tolerate a faction that claimed judicial power over prisoners. The process would end in a courtroom far from the desert, where records and testimony would replace night whispers, and where sentences would be imposed by authority that did not depend on fear. Karl did not take comfort in that. His life remained local. His danger remained immediate. He walked to work under watch and felt eyes from the yard follow him. He ate and tasted the absence of conversation. He lay down at night and felt the old fear rise as the lights went out, then subside as the patrol steps passed again, steady and indifferent, repeating because repetition was what the camp did best. In the morning he watched a maintenance crew carry fresh bedding toward the infirmary and understood the full cost of what he had done. He had lost a form of safety that had always been counterfeit, a safety purchased by silence and compliance within a group that demanded shared guilt as its bond. He had gained something smaller and more durable, a night in which the worst men in his barracks did not control the timetable. By the end of the week, the thin soldier walked in the yard under supervision, his shoulders still hunched, his breath less frantic. The camp did not restore him to the old barracks. It kept him inside a controlled orbit and kept the hard men outside it. The arrangement did not require declarations of mercy. It required only doors that stayed locked and logs that stayed complete. Karl remained alone in a way he had not been before. Isolation followed him like a shadow in daylight. Yet sleep came in longer segments, and when he woke to the tower light sliding across the ceiling, he did not hear the aisle fill with bodies. The desert wind still carried sound farther than it should have. The difference was that the night now belonged in part to a system that recorded what happened in it.